we've been interviewing CEOs who've lived here in Bronxville and made a contribution to this community. You may recall some of them. We've had Joe Rice, who is in leveraged buyouts, and we've had Marvin Bauer in consulting. We've had John Mac Carter in publishing, and we've also had Joy Kilborn, who owns her own business. Tonight, we're going to the banking world. We are delighted, or I am delighted, to have Barry Sullivan, Barry F. Sullivan, with us, who was the former CEO and chairman of the board of the First Chicago Corporation. Welcome, Barry. We're delighted to have you here.
Nice to be here, Marcia. Thanks.
Let me add a few more things to Barry's background before we start out by asking him how he ended up here in Bronxville, and that is that you should all know that currently Barry is the CEO of the New York City Partnership. He promises to tell us what that's about in a few minutes.
I'll do my best.
And the New York Chamber of Commerce. And most recently, you had the pleasure of working as the Deputy Mayor of Finance and Economic Development for Mayor Dickens. And also, we have just mentioned his role at First Chicago Corporation. Barry, now from 1980 to 1992, you lived in Chicago.
Correct.
But when did you first come to Bronxville? What brought you here?
Came to Bronxville in Bronxville Post Office, I should say, in 1965. We moved to Cedar Knolls. We bought a house, first house in Cedar Knolls. Audrey and I both were born and raised in the Bronx.
Audrey is your wife.
Right.
Right.
Born and raised in the Bronx, and by the time we moved to the house in Cedar Knolls, we had 5 children, which we ended up with 5 children, thank goodness. But
4 boys and 1 girl.
4 boys and 1 girl. I have 5 grandchildren
and your
now.
daughter lives on my street now.
That's correct, about a 9 away. But
right, yeah.
We have 5 grandchildren, and they're the reverse. 4 girls and 1 boy. So, so we're sort of getting better balance. But we came to Cedar Knolls and stayed. We really stayed there for slightly more than a year because the Chase that I was working for, Chase Manhattan
Bank, yeah.
then asked me if I would go overseas and run the London operations for them. And so Audrey and I and 5 very young children went traipsing off to London and came back in 1970.
Mm-hmm. Now, what made you come back? I mean, why were you attracted to this community?
Well, when I was coming back to work as the head of operations for the Chase, I actually came back 3 months earlier than the family because we had the children were in the. She was there. She had to move them back too. She's never forgiven me. But we love the area, and why we came here in the beginning was really sort of the dream of anybody growing up in New York, or at least a lot of us growing up in New York, to have the house in the suburbs, and we finally did it. Then, coming back in 1970, we wanted to have access to the Bronxville School. And it was plain and simple, and so we looked in the community, and we bought the house that we still own on Plateau Circle. It was financed by another Bronxville person, Virgil Conway.
Oh, good.
And in 14 months, I pay off that mortgage.
I know, we all done.
All done.
Oh, you'll have to call Virgil in.
I saw him the other night, actually, and told him that I were about ready to finish it off.
Right. Yes, the school is a magnet for many people who come here.
And was wonderful. It educated all 5 of our children.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's jump back just for a second and just do a little bit about your own personal career, and then we'll develop more about what you did in the community. But you started out in banking, and you started out at Chase Manhattan, 1957.
57, when I came out of graduate school from the University of Chicago.
Right. A lot has happened in the banking world since 1957.
Yeah, sure has.
Commercial banking primarily. Tell us a little bit about it. I mean, where have been the dramatic changes that you've had to deal with as you moved along?
Oh, I think you would say that banking, when I began, was primarily a loan and demand deposit business, and I'm thinking at the corporate level, it would be maybe less true at the retail level, because while it would be more demand deposit, there would be less lending than there is today. The credit card hadn't been invented at that time.
Oh, that's right.
So on the corporate side, lending and demand deposits, today most of the lending is really done by money markets.
Right.
The bank lending is much more residual. Demand deposits have almost disappeared for the corporation. They have zero balance accounts, and so all their excess funds are in those same money markets, and they ultimately are financing each other. And now globally, as distinct from banking when I began, which was primarily a domestic business.
Right.
And
Global.
it was really in the 60s that it became much more of an international business. And I was lucky enough to be in London, as we said, where you watch the development of the Eurodollar market, and suddenly it became as important to try to develop a relationship with Mercedes as it did Ford here in the United States. So there was an explosion of international banking. And the 70s, of course, we had in New York, we had the great problems of New York City, the virtual bankruptcy of New York City in 1975.
Were you involved in that
Yeah, I was in
committee?
David Rockefeller was our key, just as Walter Wriston from Citicorp was the key that Citi had. And David really used two different people to back him up. Tom Lebrecht, who's now the chairman of Chase, worked on the bonds, on the underwriting and the financing side. Yeah. And I worked on the operating side. I remember David saying, Barry, if we've got all these city accounts, and as the crisis was deepening, you know, we may have some large overdrafts. And I want you to be sure that we don't have large overdrafts, because if we have large overdrafts, boy, the board may relieve me of my job, but if they relieve me, I'm going to get you first. So I learned about the practices, not only banking practices, about which I knew a lot. Yeah. But as a city, how it marshaled its money, where it got its money from. For example, it used to get money at that time. We'd get a check from the state, and they would deposit the check. And it would take 48 hours to collect the check, and 2 days more that the state had the right to bounce the check. All of this becomes very important when you're thinking that New York City may be bankrupt. So the 70s in some way had the New York City part, had real estate crisis. And we go into the 80s, and you have by that time the credit card has not only been invented, but it's becoming now much more important on the consumer side. You've got the beginning of what are today established trading products. You have the beginning of interest rate swaps and all the other exotic stuff. And again, still the disintermediation, less of the bank's involvement on the loaning side. Demand deposits largely gone by that time. Yeah. And so I'd say that on the consumer side, the credit card is clearly the most dramatic advance, and on the corporate side, the trading and derivative instruments clearly the most, and the much greater link of international money markets, so that if the Prime Minister of Japan resigns, we watch it instantly in our U.S. money market.
Of course,
instantly.
We have to, and it affects our stock market instantly.
And correct.
Yeah. Now you went then to first Chicago, and tell us a little bit about your experience there, and as the CEO. And
there you had a bank that was traditionally Chicago's bank. The Continental Illinois Bank at that time had outgrown First Chicago. It was a bigger bank, and size at that particular time still counted. It counts less today. But the first was Chicago's bank because it had always been interested in the community and done really a very fine job. But it had had a difficult time with my predecessor. And so when he left and I came to the bank in the summer of 1980, there was a lot of work to be done on reestablishing customer relationships and reestablishing that the bank was an integral part of the city.
Now, you got involved in a number.
And that you have to do, a lot of that you do with very good people, but a lot of it you have to do yourself.
Yeah. What were some of the, I know you got involved in a number of organizations and activities in Chicago. What?
Yeah, I made the choice that I would spend whatever outside time I could do with in effect, the nonprofit sector. So I became a trustee of the University of Chicago. Ultimately, I was the chairman of the University of Chicago for 4 years. Became a trustee of the Art Institute of Chicago.
How wonderful!
Which was just a wonderful experience.
Sure.
And then in various kinds of civic activities. So it was Chicago's a wonderful city. It's in my view, from a commercial building point of view, it is the architectural gem of the world. I mean, it's got the most interesting buildings in the right way of anywhere in the world.
Well, my family, my mother's side is
that's a New Yorker saying that. But.
So, well, let's move on. I mean, then you came to New York, back to New York, and the mayor of New York City picks up the phone and says, "Barry, I'd like you to come and serve as deputy mayor." Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, it was really remarkable. The first business day that I had retired, I had lunch with my old boss, David Rockefeller, and friend. And we're in the Rainbow Room of the Rockefeller Center. And he said, "You know, when I got up this morning, I thought you'd be saying to me, if you got any ideas of what you might do in the whole area of community service, because that's what I really wanted to do." And he said, "I had breakfast with the mayor this morning. Are you interested in public service?" And I was flabbergasted and said, "Like what?" And he proceeds to describe
the title was
Deputy Mayor for Finance and Economic Development. And he proceeds to describe it. And he said, "Would you be interested in exploring it further?" And so I said, "Sure." You know, and I met with the first deputy mayor and my predecessor, Sally Hernandez Pinheiro, a wonderful Hispanic lady. And they needed somebody quickly. And I was doing a major study of the Board of Education in the city of Chicago. I had raised $1.5 million of money. We've gotten a lot of pro bono work. And I just couldn't, the job was going to take, we thought at that time, to about mid-year. So I just couldn't leave. So I said I'd be interested, but I can't come back that fast. And David Dinkins called me the next day and said he'd like, would I come and talk to him? He thought maybe there was a way of working on this if I could come back somewhat earlier. David also knows that I had promised my family, my kids, my daughter particularly, who lives in Bronxville now,
Mary Ellen on Hawthorne Road, yes,
that I would not do anything for through the summer. So I proceeded to. I talked to David. We spent 2 hours together the first time. He's absolutely just a marvelous man. What you see is what you get. He's a real gentleman. He's very smart. He's a math major from Howard University. Oh, wow. He's got the best verbal memory of any man I ever met.
Really?
Before him, I would have said David Rockefeller. But if you say something to David 6 months later, he can quote you on that. And so,
that's frightening.
But we really had very good chemistry. And I worked it so that I thought I could get the Board of Ed job done by the beginning of May, which we did. We delivered to the city. And David just basically kept the job open, and I did some work for the city all during that time. One of the things you realize that there are networks.
Yes.
David Dinkins doesn't know me. He knows that David Rockefeller says he's a good person. He checks other people in New York, but he's checking them in the business community. And David didn't know the business community. One of the reasons he wanted a businessman was because he realized he had to get better connected.
Yes.
So the business community is saying, I'm a good person, but that's not all David's constituency. He comes from an African-American background. So he goes and checks in Chicago with the African-American community. it turns out that one of the things I did in Chicago is I did a lot of work with Harold Washington, the first black mayor of Chicago.
What did you do?
I was a businessman that gave Harold a fair amount of advice on what the business community was like, on the role of First Chicago, its traditional role of helping the community. And I also, during the famous council wars, when the largely white city council and the black mayor had this terrible struggle in Chicago, I, from time to time, played messenger between them because they had difficulty in talking to each other because of their constituents, even when they wanted to talk to each other. Couldn't. Well, Dinkins goes and checks, and I come out as somebody that the community says he's all right. So,
you know, it's interesting because you left for 10 years and Bronxville hadn't seen you. We see Audrey and around, but we hadn't seen you. And suddenly we read in the New York Times, Barry Sullivan is now the deputy mayor of New York City. It all makes sense now with all the background you picked up at Chase Manhattan under David Rockefeller and all that you did in Chicago. You were really primed for this position.
You had David was a very important part in that the commitment to public service is something that's sort of in his being. And you pick that up as part of the atmosphere of Chase.
In this position, what are you most proud of that you did, or what did you do? I mean, and what did you seek to do?
It's easy. I did two major things, but the one thing was crucial.
Yeah.
I think during the 20 months I was there, we stabilized the business base of the city.
How did you?
We had been losing some firms, but the one that was the sort of Damocles when I joined the Dinkins administration was Morgan Stanley. It was public, it was out there, it would show up in The Economist of all places, and it was really a symbol of was New York in sort of permanent decline or not.
Right.
And we kept Morgan Stanley. And not only have we kept Morgan Stanley, but Morgan Stanley has now invested in 2 buildings in the Times Square area. And so they are really very, very committed.
How does one, for those who aren't familiar with this, I mean, how did you work with Morgan Stanley people to keep them in New York City?
You had to deal with some of the problems in New York City. New York City is a high-cost city. One of the advantages of the overbuilding of commercial real estate was that rents had gone down dramatically. And so as Morgan Stanley was coming to the end of a lease, where it was looking, should they extend, or they had bought land in Stamford, Connecticut, or should they go and build in Connecticut? The drop in rents was the single strongest thing New York City had gone. That is something that I had no control over.
Yeah.
Just sheer, in a way, it was an accident of history, but it was our advantage.
Yeah.
And then we could work with them on taxes, and we did on taxes. We worked an incentive package for them to stay. The other thing that they thought about, and any firm thinks about, is the quality of life.
Yes.
And when the quality of life is talked about in New York, the first issue is crime. The second issue is education. And the third issue tends to be the infrastructure. All the potholes in the streets and
transit system.
Although the transit system for when I left in 1980, where I would say it was an unmitigated disaster, to when I lived in New York, I was an actual resident of New York for those 20 months and lived all during the week in New York. I took the subway back and forth.
That's a 10-year span.
The amount of time that and the amount of improvement in that system is unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's so good. So in keeping Morgan Stanley, we kept the most symbolic commercial firm. And Prudential, right around that time, was also very important for downtown New York. The other major firm we kept was UNICEF. UNICEF gave a lot of, and it was New Rochelle, seriously bidding against New York City. It was really little New Rochelle, but they did a very, very good job. And we finally did a very good job. We had the State Department on our side. And if you think of New York City, if you think of Manhattan, where most of the tax base of New York City is, in keeping Morgan Stanley, we anchored the western part of Midtown. And in keeping UNICEF, we anchored the eastern part. And in keeping Prudential Securities, who did the major lease at One New York Plaza, we kept the most difficult part of New York City from getting even more difficult, and that's downtown Lower Manhattan, where the vacancy rate's around 23%, where there is no clear sign of turnaround today. Where
even today there isn't. This is
where there is in Midtown.
1994. That's interesting. Well, we could spend hours on that, but I do want to get to this, the New York City partnership, because that's what you're doing now.
Right.
You're the CEO there. Can you just tell briefly what the partnership does?
Well, it's really, the partnership are basically the major corporations in New York.
Large companies.
Large companies and important, influential individuals. They may not be major corporations. They may be influential women. They may be influential African American. So it is what I've called the powerful and the wise. And we have about 200 partners. It's a large group. Let me just do, the Chamber of Commerce is medium to small size business.
And you've got two hats here.
And I wear two hats, which is very unusual in the United States. The roles are different, even though there's overlap, and there is it's sometimes difficult to explain. The Chamber of Commerce represents the business interests of the community. So it is interested in Albany in lowering corporate income taxes, for example. That's a standard Chamber of Commerce activity. And it is also interested in economic development. How do we create jobs? The partnership is broader and is interested in the economic and social well-being of New York.
Quality of life.
And it is the largest single and two-family home builder in the city of New York. It does 50% of all new...
The partnership builds these
50% of all new single-family and two-family homes in the city for the last 10 years have been built by the partnership.
I had no idea.
It is interested in education. We've got a very good relationship with Chancellor Cortines, which was helpful recently. And we're also, so we've got education, we've got housing, we've got economic development, and lastly, which bridges them, we have a terrific advocacy group. That is, we work with the state, we work with the city in terms of legislation. The city right now is, the mayor has said he wants to privatize various activities. But there's a bill in the city council that will make it very difficult for him to do that. We believe that privatization is an important feature of the government in New York City, and so we are working very hard to
do that.
To oppose the privatization. It's probably not, you probably can't oppose the anti-privatization forces. What you can do is you can channel it maybe to where both parties can live with each other. So that's some of the stuff we do. And so where it's helpful is I understand the private sector. I spent most of my life. But I understand government.
The public sector,
and I know what goes on in the city council, and I met with the head of the city council, Peter Vallone, yesterday, talking about privatization. And I don't need after 20 months in city government, I don't need a long course from Peter as to why he is doing what he's doing. He can, when we can talk about individuals, I know who the council members are, and I know where they come from.
You know where people are going and where they have come from. Well, we actually here in Westchester County, we have the similar, the Westchester County Association is the similar equivalent, I think, to the partnership, but not as expansive. But,
yeah, they do some anti-New York City advertising.
Right. I remember when you were trying to keep UNICEF in New York, a whole group of people trying to get them out here in New Rochelle. Well, let's move.
Well, the reason I was so worried about that is, in my view, had that happened, it would have been the beginning of the unraveling of the UN in New York City.
Yes.
The biggest competitor against New York City is Bonn, Germany, because when the German government goes to Berlin, Bonn will be a ghost town. And they are very, very anxious to pick up whatever UN-related pieces they can. And UNICEF was, a part of the drama of UNICEF was keeping Bonn away from it.
Well, congratulations. Let's move on, simply only because we only have so much time to talk about your contribution to the community. And I always find this incredible with people like you that I've been interviewing, how they possibly find the time in the midst of their professional lives to contribute to the community. But from 1974 to 1980, you served on the school board, and I believe you were chairman for at least 2 to 3 years.
3 years.
3 years.
Yes.
Can you tell us some of the major issues at that time?
I've thought about it, knowing that we were going to do this interview, and I think we were probably at a time when I was on the board. I was on the board for 2 years before I was chairman. Our superintendent was Lou Braun, and Beulah Hagedorn ran the elementary school.
Beulah is still here in the village.
It was a terrific lineup. If I were to categorize the management style of Lou, Beulah, Bob Spenek at the time, it was a great team. Mm-hmm. I would say it was an informal management style, mm-hmm. but it was very effective. They knew everybody, and things were done very, very easily and very, very well. But there was with Lou retiring, now you had to rethink, what do you want in the superintendent? Mm-hmm. And there was some significant part of the community saying we've got to become a more formal management style, more accountability, more teacher evaluations, more systematic in the way we operate. Mm-hmm. And so when we set up the search committee, and the search committee was broadly representative of the community, it was not just the board.
Yes.
I mean, we discussed these, and ultimately we selected Jack Helfrich. Jack ultimately left Bronxville as the superintendent. Yeah. Jack ultimately left Bronxville in the early '80s to go to the Buffalo.
Yeah.
And there was some, and there was some controversy because the moving from informal to formal is not done without mm-hmm. a certain amount of pain. What's interesting is that today in the New York City school system, Ray Cortines talks about accountability, talks about standards. Mm-hmm. What should a fifth grader learn? And that was some of the things we did. A lot of what we were grappling with in that mid to later 70s, Cortines is grappling with in the city of New York today.
15 years
in many
later.
ways, we were well ahead of the time. Mm-hmm.
The accountability, they're measuring a performance.
Yeah, what are we trying to achieve? Yeah. And because in many ways,
assessment.
The board is and you were mayor here at Bronxville. You can get wrapped up in budget things.
Oh, yeah.
Teacher negotiations, salary negotiations, tax rates, mm-hmm. and capital budgets and all that. And they're very important to do as a board, but that's not the soul of the school. Mm-hmm. And so you've really got to work hard to make sure you're at least trying to be connected to the soul of the school. Yeah. I was very fortunate in my time because of our we had a 7-person board. 4 of them were women. Mary Sargent, Ellie Erstad, Jane Molman, and Ann Sauter. And they were outstanding women. And what was amazing to me is in my business career up until that time, I had never dealt with able women like that at the peer level. Mm-hmm, we were peers. That was only a time when women, say from the early 70s, were beginning to come into the business world. So right. they were really young. They hadn't gone up the ladder. This was a great experience for me.
Well, all those women were leaders, and some of them still are in the community.
Yeah, they're terrific.
New time. We don't have too much more time, and so I'm curious to know, with all your background in Chicago and then extensively in New York City and in Bronxville, where you see in particular the New York City, Bronxville going in the future.
Bronxville is easy in one way. It seems to me that one of the great things about this community, it is holistic. It's got these wonderful houses on small land but positioned so that nobody feels they're on top of each other. The great school system, which to me is the most important asset of Bronxville. And so a sine qua non is that we keep that school system absolutely first rate. And if we do that, then the values of the homes and the value of the whole experience in the community will be assured, with one exception.
What is that?
And that is, we're linked to the city of New York. And how New York City goes will determine how its suburbs go. And Bronxville is the really in close suburb. There is no way of Bronxville hiding from New York City. And therefore, we have to care about New York City. And one difference between Chicago and New York, Chicago and New York City, is the involvement of the suburbs.
In the city
itself. There is much greater involvement in Chicago by suburban people than there is in New York City. If you were to look at any major, let's say a cultural activity or a Chicago Symphony opening or the Lyric Opera or whatever, you will find that they are most often run, when there are women involved, by suburban women, not by native Chicago women.
How did that come about, and why don't you think we do it here?
It's a tradition in Chicago that, you ask why, but nobody really knows. But they're Central City. They're very proud of Chicago. But that the woman in Winnetka, which would be the Chicago equivalent of Scarsdale, is very much involved in the city of Chicago. We see much less of this here. Part of that is the size of New York. New York is 2.5 times the size of Chicago in population. More than that when you do all the illegals in New York. But it is 20 times as complex. At least 20 times as complex. To go and talk to Harold Washington about some things in the city council, you can talk to a very few people and get things done. Now that comes out of the tradition of Mayor Daley, and while you've got the efficiency that came out of Mayor Daley, you've got also the question about how representative is it, how autocratic. New York City is much more representative, and it is sure as hell less efficient as a result. And so you've got the trade-off that comes between representation and efficiency, and then you got this enormous size. The New York City school system, public school system is 1 million kids. Chicago's public school system is 400,000. New York City is growing, school system is growing at 25,000 a year, and that is equivalent, I believe, to the city of Rochester or the city of Syracuse, one or the other. And so New York City has to create a Rochester school system every year. And until you begin to understand that complexity, you don't quite understand New York. But given the complexity, somebody then from Bronxville who says, I'd like to help in New York, what on earth do they do? I mean, this huge metropolis.
Well, that's exactly the question. Where would you have us contribute
I would really look at the nonprofit sector. Because the nonprofit sector of New York, of Chicago, of San Francisco, of what, is always looking for volunteers and for help. And by nonprofit, I just don't mean the cultural sector, but there's a social service sector. There's a whole variety. New York City has more nonprofits involved in more activities than you can shake a stick at. Neighborhood nonprofits. If you got an interest in the South Bronx, which, by the way, is enormously different today than Jimmy Carter in 1979. Yeah, but you have to go to see that. I mean, there are all sorts of community groups and neighborhood groups that really look for help from anybody who is willing to volunteer. So I'd get into the nonprofit sector, something that seems interesting. If it's healthcare, I mean, there's plenty of that. The beauty of doing that is not only will you help make a difference, but I think you'll learn a lot about the complexity of New York City. And in some respect, have some tolerance for why it is so difficult to get things done.
Right.
Harold Washington, maybe I just gave me a great lesson in math. We had a breakfast one time. I had asked him why he was willing to take a certain beating from the press. And he said to me, and it's a chilling breakfast, he said to me, on any issue, Barry, 80% of the voters divide 40-40, and I don't have to pay attention to them. You think of that line. And then he said, of that
20%.
Group that you're talking about, how many people do you think there are in the city of Chicago? And I said, I don't really know. And he said, well, about 8 to 9%. And he said, do I have to tell you what to divide that by? That's why I pay attention to that group. My experience with city government is the Harold Washington math is absolutely right, but it doesn't require 8 divided by 20. There's a very famous incident, if you read the Metropolitan section of the Times, which is always interesting to read. 67 Irish Hanson cab drivers got a law changed in the city of New York and got unanimous opposition from the business community. And it was done with the opposition of all the council people in Manhattan. It was driven by a Queens council person, an Irishman. And it would take the next hour to trace you through all the politics that could have 67 people oppose the entire business community and win.
Robert Wood, a scholar, once wrote a book on New York City, 1800 Governments. And that definitely describes it. Well, Barry, I'm sure you will generate from a number of the people in our audience some questions about how they can volunteer in the not-for-profit world of New York City. I just want to take this time to thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure, and the partnership sounds like it is really working very well for you and the city.
We're doing a lot of thinking about even making more of an impact, particularly in the area of job creation, which is the biggest long-range problem of New York City. When it solves for its budget, which it will do, as painful as it will be, job creation will be the long-run problem. Not job creation at the high end. New York City as the headquarters company, as the financial center, as the accounting center, as the advertising center, as the legal center.
It's a wonderful city.
All those will not only survive, they will grow relative to the rest of the world. But the loss of the manufacturing jobs and the loss and the automation of many of the clerical jobs means that we have to work very hard at the less educated job, because remember, our big urban cities have a hell of a lot of less educated people while they have very educated people. And if we don't create the jobs over a long period of time, we can end up with two different cities. And I would say that the example of what happens when you get there would be Detroit.
Oh, really?
Where you end up with business leaving the city. And if anybody's been to, I'm sure some people in the audience have been to Detroit, it is a very, very difficult city.
Well, I hate to leave on a glum note, and we will trust that you will help to find these jobs in the future. But again, thank you very much, Barry, for joining us. And thank you very much for joining us, too. Good night.